Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the last day of ICAW International Compost Awareness Week. This is the last episode of ComCon Composting Conversations brought to you by the North Carolina Composting Council. I also want to thank my employer, the City of Durham, who supports me in spreading the good word about compost and composting, using compost, making compost, educating, not just in Durham and around the state, but now apparently internationally for International Compost Awareness Week. So it's the largest education effort in the world, and it is truly an international effort with a poster and video contest that's held in the fall. This year's winner was a person from Singapore who won the poster contest, and I just love thinking about composting here in Durham and someone composting in Singapore and other places around the world. I just, like, we are unified through the love of soil, through the desire to return nutrients back into the soil, grow healthy food, all that good stuff. I'm kind of ad-libbing my introduction here, but I want to also give a shout out to Renee Wallace, who is with Food Plus Detroit. It was her brainchild of composting conversations that she held last year. And I took that inspiration. We're doing ComCon 2023 with a little Durham twist. ComCon may sound familiar for the North Carolina Composting Council. If you have any questions about the Composting Council, it is a volunteer organization. We have a volunteer board of directors. I'm the president, the person holding the camera, and who's been involved with all of the technology to make ComCon possible this week. The gorgeous poster that you all used to sign up. Kate Sullivan is our treasurer. Thank you so much, Kate, for everything that you've done this week. It's been truly amazing. I am so excited. I just feel like it's going to send ripples through the community and beyond. So anyway, let's see, am I forgetting something, Christine? You've been here all week. What am I forgetting? Oh, if you want to find out more about the Composting Council, please visit the website. And you can also email info@carolinacompost.com. That's our email address. Christine Whitmire, our newest board member and also NCDEQ organic specialist, is on the keys. She's popping all the info in the chat. And I'm going to talk about composting here at home for about half an hour or so, and then we're going to open it up to the room. Thank you all this week for all of our speakers. It's been incredible. Also all volunteers. And thank you for coming, all of you attendees. You're amazing. All right, so let's get started. I'm here in my beautiful sweet crib here in Northgate Park in Durham, North Carolina. And I like to say anybody can compost anywhere. I have been composting outdoors. I learned how to compost with my mom. She was a really skilled gardener and grew a lot of food for a family of 5 in her half-acre garden in upstate New York. And so I like to say everything I know about dirt, I learned from my mother. And so she has 2 green thumbs. I have at least 1, maybe 1.5. But when I went to college, I was in Binghamton, New York, and living in a 4th-story walk-up, surrounded by brick and concrete, completely divorced from the garden and the soil and the earth that I love and grew up with. And a friend of mine in the environmental studies program gave me a handful of her worms and taught me how to compost indoors using a variety of containers. This is a container that I use now, but I composted in a little apartment. And since then, I've moved with my worms and I've shared my worms hundreds and hundreds of times. So I like to say that these are the great grandworms of the worms that I had when I was in college. They have multiplied, I have shared them, and it's like the sourdough starter for environmentalists, I think, sharing worms. And this is an indoor system. I don't keep it outside. We're just outside right now. I have a little shelf on my kitchen counter. I keep it underneath. It's You would never know that I was composting inside the house. When I tell people that I'm composting indoors, they usually say, oh, it must smell, or they must attract flies, or some such things. When I teach composting, I always like to start with the vermicompost because it encapsulates all of the fundamentals of composting in one small container. First off, no flies, none. You see no flying organisms. Also, we don't have smell-o-vision, but if we did, I would say virtually no odor. A sweet, earthy smell. Kate's nodding. She can attest. It's just this lovely, earthy aroma. And it's not because there isn't plenty of organic matter in here. What you notice right on the top is some moist newspaper. In any composting situation, if you're talking about aerobic composting, there are 4 basic ingredients: carbon, nitrogen, water, air. That's it. So in my indoor worm bin, I like using newspaper as my carbon source. It's an indoor system. I stop and I get the indie still every week and see what's going on in the world and what shows are happening. And I use that indie and I shred it. And this is at about what we call 70% saturation. You can just see a little bit of wetness, a little bit of drips coming off on my fingers. That's about what we want. They say it's about the wetness of a wrung out sponge. You want it good and moist, visibly wet, but not soupy, because the worms need air to breathe. How do you have air in there, you say, when it's so wet? Well, the carbon provides structure and porosity. So even though this is wet, 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 you can see how crumbly it is. And these, if you look really, really close, you might even be able to see some of the newspaper fibers in there, but they help puff up the compost and provide that structure so that there are air pockets, even though it's wet, wet, wet. The worms also help aerate as they move through the organic matter. And I also have air holes in the side, drainage holes in the bottom to catch any extra moisture. I don't want them to be swimming. I just want them to be nice and wet because they breathe through their skin. If you were here on Wednesday and you heard Genesis from New Soil Vermiculture talk about worm anatomy, I love what she had to say. No ears, no eyes, all vibes. And it's all through their skin. They have a semi-permeable membrane and they breathe through their skin. And so they have to have oxygen, even though they don't have lungs. They're miraculous creatures. Anyway, watch that video. We'll have everything recorded. At any rate, the nitrogen comes from food scraps. This is an indoor system, as I said. And so this is this is my indoor worm bin. This is a nice asparagus steamer. I got this container at a thrift store. It was kind of expensive for a thrift store. I think it was $4. But it is, so I have a tiny kitchen, just a little galley. And so it has a narrow profile, which I like, nice and shiny, stainless steel, doesn't hold odors. But believe me, any container with a lid can be your countertop collector. I have also used Blue Bunny ice cream containers because they have a nice snap top lid, and I got to eat the ice cream, and then I had a countertop container. There's other ones that you can get that you can hook on the shelf underneath your countertop, so they're completely out of sight. You find what works for you. You find what works for your kitchen. Some people like to freeze their stuff before they give it to their worms or put it in their outdoor compost. I don't do that just because it doesn't stay that long. I don't want it to attract fruit flies, so it doesn't stay on my countertop for more than 2 or 3 days. By then it's time for it to go outside, which is why I like kind of a smaller container. When it's full, it's time to go either into my worm bin or into my outdoor compost, which we will talk about in just one moment. At any rate, this is the nitrogen source. This is the energy. And so this is energy for all organisms, my coffee grounds, my icky bit of avocado that I didn't want to eat. I've got orange peels in here too. I don't generally put orange peels in with my worms because of the acidity. And, orange and lemons and other citrus are often used as an antiseptic because they are antibacterial. So you can find orange cleaners and things like that. So if it's antibacterial, I don't really want to put it in with my worms because this is a living, breathing ecosystem. And so there's tons of bacteria in here with the worms. The worms are actually eating bacteria that are eating the rotting food as well as eating the rotting food itself. So people are like, well, how come it's not smelly? And, I wish I understood that, but it's definitely not because of the lack of organics in here. Let me see if I can find, here it is. Here's where it is. I just hulled a bunch of strawberries this weekend. It's strawberry season. So I mean, the worms just love, oh, and there's some broccoli. Now that I dig in, I get a little bit of broccoli smell. You know, those calciferous vegetables can have a little bit of a sulfur smell. And so I detect a slight odor, but it's not too bad. And it was down inside. Anyway, there are absolutely thousands of worms in here, and they're going to town. They already ate the strawberry hulls by the looks of it. They are absolutely gone. And that was from Saturday. So, or excuse me, Sunday, this past weekend. So they're gone, and the worms make this beautiful vermicompost, this beautiful casting. So I'm very, very picky about what goes in my worm bin. You know, fresh off the cutting board. The other stuff is what I take to my backyard compost. So if you have questions about vermicomposting, that was probably the fastest vermicompost 101 that I've ever done. As you can see, it's a very simple system. We've just got this plastic container, air holes in the side, drainage holes in the bottom. Some people ask about worm tea, and I don't really have any seepage coming out. I've got a pretty good moisture balance, but when this does seep, it's not actually worm tea. This is actually leachate. You know, there's a wide spectrum of bacteria that can live in a composting system, and those ones that are occurring early, you know, they are able to kind of break through the cellulosic layer. They're breaking, you know, carbon bonds, and you don't really want to put that raw on your fruits and vegetables. You really want to make a tea out of the finished compost, which looks like dirt, smells like dirt, and is cool to the touch. Okay. And the way that I harvest my worm bin, I'll actually take a tarp, spread it on the floor, and empty the contents of my worm bin. Anything that I can recognize, like newspaper or those broccoli stems that you saw, I'll take it out, put it back in the worm bin. The rest is finished compost, and the worms are sensitive to light. Even though they don't have eyes, they sense light through their skin. It's absolutely incredible. And they'll go down beneath the surface of the compost, and then you can scrape off that top layer of compost. The worms are exposed, they'll go down again, and then you can scrape that off. This is actually vermicompost that I harvested, I think this spring. Obviously, this bin is very, very full. I need to harvest it, but I'm having the embarrassing problem of almost too much compost. So this is from last year, or excuse me, last spring. Yeah, wait, no, it's probably October. It's about in the fall. And you can see I've kept it in a what would you call it? Airtight bucket with a snapping lid, and it's kept it moist. And it's just so amazing. I mean, this is rocket fuel for my plants. If you were on the call yesterday, there was some talk about soil mixes. When I was living in an apartment, I still make my own soil mix. I'll get a bag of the cheapest topsoil that you can find, mix it about 3-to-1 soil to compost, and then I'll add a puffing agent like vermiculite or maybe some peat moss. I don't really like to use peat moss, just for various reasons. I like peat bogs rather than moss, but that's me. But vermiculite kind of keeps it puffy, because if you're just planting in compost and soil, it's going to clump around the roots and you're going to get root rot, or it's, you know, you need air, you need some puffiness. And just mineral and organic isn't enough. You need a little bit of a fluffy thing to puff it up. But that's how I make my own soil mix. And using vermicompost, I might also take it and just top dress a plant. This is a lemon verbena that I wintered over inside, and I'm just going to take a little bit of the vermicompost and dress it around the top so that it will have nutrients for summer. Just going to dress it just like that and water the top.
Yeah, and Muriel, we have one question. How long can you store finished vermicompost before you use it?
Well, obviously I can store it for months and months. You know, I don't feel like the nutrients go anywhere when it's in a sealed bucket. You know, it's pretty much fixed. So the thing with storing it, I had gloves and I didn't put them on. This is story of my life. I know, too late. So the only thing that I would say, the secret to storing compost or vermicompost in particular, is to keep it in a tight fitting container so that it's airtight. If it dries out, it'll get like a brick, and it's really hard to get it back to this beautiful crumbly texture. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah,
I mean,
and there was a follow-up
yeah.
question. Do you store your, or what do you store your finished compost in? So it sounds like you answered that, you know, in a tight-fitting plastic container.
Yep. I like a kitty litter bucket, personally. Obviously, I'm a fan of reuse, but they work great. They're nice. They have a narrow profile so that I can stack them and store them if I need to. But you know, if you have a cat, or if you know someone who has a cat, maybe they'll let you have their buckets. Are we ready to go down to the? Are there any other vermicomposting questions before we move on to the next phase of our?
That was the only one so far, but everyone feel free to put in your questions in the chat.
So as you can tell, I don't belong to an HOA. We were talking about that earlier, you know, earlier this week, you know, that there can be some pretty significant rules and regulations around having visible composters, having, you know, sticks and piles of things in your yard, and you know, I think this is the way I like to live, kind of on the wild side. And, you know, I've lived in this house since 2009. I've had a lot of different neighbors, this set of neighbors. So now I'm actually going to get sunlight in this corner, which I'm very excited about. So I'll be able to grow. At any rate, so this is my setup. Yes, I'm president of the North Carolina Composting Council, and this is my what's up?
Oh, I think we're getting video back. I was just letting Kate know that we froze for a sec, but we can see you now.
Great, thank you. Okay, cool. So this is what I call a Darth Vader style of bin. You can get them at a lot of garden centers. They may be upwards of $100, $120. The town of Cary sells them. Wake County sells them. I think Orange County sells them year round. There are special sales. I think there might be some people in the audience that actually even know more about the schedule on that than me. But I have had this composter for about 20 years. I'm not exaggerating. I'm one of those people that actually moved with their compost and their composter. And did they get upset that they were carrying boxes of dirt? Maybe, but they helped me move anyway. This, as you can see, I've got it, you know, it's holding together with bungee cords, but it still works. It's just a concentrated vessel open to the ground. Some people like the tumbling units, and to be honest, for a backyard compost, I'm not a huge fan of those. I want my system to be open to the soil, because if I'm feeding them all this gorgeous, energetic food from my kitchen, then I want the critters to be able to come up through the soil. Basically, what you're doing is creating a soil ecosystem. Why would you put it in the sky? I don't know. The other thing too with those tumbling units is when you're adding fresh material, all the fixed compost that you have is being mixed with the finished material. You don't actually get any cured compost unless you have another container. And for me, you know, I don't necessarily want compost to occupy the entirety of my backyard. So that's why I like these systems. It's just my preference. Everybody has their own preference for different reasons, and I totally respect that. This is what I like, though, and this is what I'm teaching. So again, carbon, nitrogen, water, air. In my backyard, I don't know if you notice, it's pretty shady. I've got 3 willow oak trees. I have an embarrassment of riches when it comes to carbon. And so the leaves I collect in the fall and I save them. This carbon is going to last me all summer long while I compost in my composter. I harvested this last spring. I got 80 gallons of finished compost out of this baby. So now I actually have a neighbor that is bringing me her nitrogen scraps, and she used to use a curbside service to collect, and I was sharing some cuttings of thornless blackberries, and she's like, you know, I use this service to I told her that they rooted best in compost-rich soil. She brings a bucket that she used to put out to her curb. She brings me this bucket about once every 2 weeks. She's actually out of town right now because usually she'll go ahead and put it in the compost herself. So remember what I said about no flies, no odors. I'm going to open this up and voila. I swear I have not touched this since Tuesday. So I'm like, whoop, okay, everything's good. My temperature degrees-ish, almost 90. It's not what I would call a cool compost, but it's not exactly hot either. It's what we'll call.
What was that temperature again, Muriel?
90. But this is a compost thermometer. And as you can see, it can go up to 200. I've never had it go up that high. Maybe 130 is about what I can get in my backyard compost. But I do want to get it hot. And the reason for that is it kills pathogens and also kills any seeds. Well, except for tomato seeds. I don't think that you can actually kill them. Lots of volunteers, squash, cucumbers, things like that. I don't put weeds in my compost that have gone to seed. You know, usually I just kind of pitch them and I'll use them for suppression in other areas. Just try to keep those organics in the soil or on my yard. I don't really want anything to go. I run a try to keep this as closed a system as possible. But the carbon, nitrogen, water, air is very different here than it is in my worm bin. The worm bin is, you know, the worms are doing the activity. They don't like it hot. However, when you mix carbon and nitrogen in a higher volume, they react with each other chemically and it produces heat. In that hot environment, you support what they call thermophilic bacteria, heat-loving bacteria. And so they thrive in a hot environment and they eat the nitrogenous waste. One of the, I think, Craig Coker, one of the, I mean, he's an old salt in the composting industry. I heard him give a talk so many years ago, and he said, nitrogen is the fuel that burns the carbon. You need both for that hot pile. And what I like to do is about 50-50 by volume. A lot of the literature will say something like 30-1 carbon to nitrogen. And that's because food scraps also contain carbon, but they have more nitrogen than, say, the leaves do, which is basically none. So that might be 50-1, 100-1 carbon to nitrogen. Food scraps are more like 15-1, 20-1. If you want to do that math, go ahead. I just go by volume. I go by feel. When you've been composting for a while, it will tell you what it needs. If it's too slimy, too stinky, it needs more carbon. It needs that to fluff it up. If it's cold, you may not have a good balance of carbon and nitrogen, or it may be dry because those microbes need a moist environment in order to thrive. So carbon, nitrogen, water, air, 50-50 by volume, carbon and nitrogen, 70% saturation approximately, and you can't stop it. It's gonna cook. So how do I keep the flies down? This beautiful, I have a lid, but then I keep a lid of carbon on top, and that just kind of, you know, carbon filters, you know how they help reduce odors. It's the same idea, but I also like to keep a little lid of carbon on top just to keep the flies off. Flies are surface to air organisms. They'll land on the surface to feed. Also, if I do have odorous stuff, sometimes, okay, true confessions. You'll never hear in any of the literature to put meat or bones in your dairy or in your compost, or dairy in your compost. I don't eat dairy anymore, but I do eat chicken. I have pork chops, and I will put the bones in my compost, but I want to bury it. And this is a very mature compost. So the gristle and the fat and whatnot that might be left on the bones breaks down really quickly. That protein is just as valuable to the little microbes as it is to me, and they will chow it down in no time flat. Shrimp shells also go in here. Fish heads also go in here, and they are gone in a matter of days, but I bury it very, very deeply because I don't want to attract critters. I've got raccoons, I've got possums, I've got the neighbor's dog likes to get loose from time to time, and they are a terror on a compost if they smell something that they want. So I want to bury it really, really well. as I said, I have not harvested this since spring. So this has been going all year. My neighbor, she's bringing me 5 gallons every 2 weeks. I bring one of these out every 2 days or so. How is it not full? It's amazing. Compost will literally break down to a quarter its original volume. And as it's compressing, the bottom is where the fixing is happening. Remember I said with the tumbler, you're mixing the finished material with the raw material. Here we're putting the raw material on top and the fixing is happening at the bottom. I haven't been here since last spring, so I'm going to do a reveal in a little while to see what's happening down there. I'm kind of excited. We'll see. But in the meantime, I want to just take a look and see what's happening in here. I put my last bucket in on Tuesday, and we're just going to take a little look. Ooh, yeah, doesn't look like much. But, you know, Chelsea was here with one of her buckets. I had my regular kitchen scraps, and it's just cooking away. You can feel a little bit of heat coming off there. We know it's about 90 degrees. It's about 80 degrees out here, so it's a little bit warmer inside. The only thing I would say, if I was going to critique my compost, I would say maybe it's a little dry. It might be a little dry. Not too bad though. So I'm going to go ahead. Oh, did I just see a bone? I might have seen a pork chop bone. But when I'm going to add my fresh material, all I do is I dig a little pit in the center, just like that. I'm going to take my fruit and veggie scraps. So I'm a coffee drinker, and if I don't clean out my bucket, it gets pretty soupy and gross. So I wash it out, and then I'll wipe it with a paper towel, put that paper towel in the bottom, and then I can swish the whole thing out, and it kind of keeps it clean. I also like to fill this with water when I come out, because then I'm also watering my compost as I'm putting in my let's see. I'm actually going to wait before I add Chelsea's. You want to come around to the side, Kate? Let's do the. Let's see what we got going on inside. You can tell I trust that this is going to go well. Oh, geez. You don't need a gym membership if you compost. Just say, keeps you strong. So I love random ancient tools. So here we go. Okay. Is taking a liking to the compost. You can tell, I wonder if it's this magnolia here, or maybe it's this privet. Great. Oh my gosh, look at this. How gorgeous.
If
so that's my backyard compost. We got
it froze for a second, but
back again. Okay.
I think we're back.
Great. We're doing pretty good. So one thing I noticed in here are some worm eggs. There's a nice little worm cocoon. Again, Genesis gave a beautiful talk about worm anatomy and reproduction. And so pretty much, you can't identify anything. It's just maybe some brown leaves, but this is my finished compost. Kate's a professional. How would you grade this?
Looks good.
Looks good. Class A.
All right, just bear with us. I think we'll get back on. Oh, there we go. We're back on.
All right, so I'm going to put the bungees back on.
And Muriel, we do have some questions when you get a moment.
Okay. Yeah, come on.
All right, the first one is, what do you say to people who are worried about attracting snakes or raccoons if they start composting? And that is one of the common fears I hear from people who have never composted outdoors.
I mean, I just say, You want to have a good balance of carbon and nitrogen to make sure that it's breaking down very thoroughly. Those creatures, raccoons and possums, they like fresh vegetative material. They're not going to want to paw in where it's rotting and it's hot. That's not their thing. They're going to want to kind of have a buffet, stuff that's on the surface that's easy to get to. And even though this bin is decrepit and it's falling apart, a creature could get in here if they wanted to. So that's why it's very important to think of it as a soil ecosystem, right? You want to bury everything, make it available for soil dwelling organisms, not the organisms that live on top of the soil, not the terrestrial creatures, the subsoil organisms. So if you bury everything really well, you have a good balance of carbon and nitrogen, it's going to break down really quickly, really effectively. As you saw, I just put that in on Tuesday. It's Friday. You couldn't really identify any of that stuff. And, it's just going to break down really quickly. Basically, what I've got here is my own digester. It's breaking down nitrogen very quickly. If you're not attracting, rodents or other creatures, then you're not going to have snakes either. The only snake that I have encountered, and it's been a long time, is a worm snake. They're about this long. They're kind of gray brown. They eat worms. They don't even have teeth. The only difference between them and a worm is their size. They have scales and they have eyes. So that's one way to tell the difference. But, in this environment, in this habitat where I've got a lot of, vegetation and, I use logs to line my walkway. It's very natural, I would say. I encourage, actually, I'm a fan of having a snake under my shed or dwelling somewhere because they will eat the rodents. They will eat the mice. They will eat, other critters that I don't actually want around, but they're not coming for my compost. This is not their jam. This is not what they like to eat. This is not what other critters like to eat. So if you keep in mind that you're making a soil, then you'll probably only get soil dwelling organisms to come. How's that sound?
Yeah, that's great. And this is kind of a follow-up question. Sophie asks, would you take any extra precautions if you live in bear country with daily visits by bear families?
Boy, that makes my neighbor's dog look tame. Yeah, I don't live in bear country. Is there someone on the call that does? Christine, you live in bear country.
Yeah, I can chime into that. Yeah, I like to say, just make sure you're composting correctly. Like Muriel mentioned, always, have a nice bank of browns to add on top of your food scraps. Make sure the food scraps are buried in the center. And if you are, still having issues, if they, does get into it, you can pair up a tumbler with a bin like Muriel has. That can kind of be like a, stage one of the compost. And then once it breaks down a little bit further where they won't go after it, then you can put it in that. But I have bears in my neighborhood and they've never been in my compost bin. I also have a Darth Vader like Muriel has. And I just always make sure to keep it, moist and always have my browns, but just make sure you're composting correctly in bear country.
Never mind that. I'll do that later when I'm not on camera. I think the other good point, so using a structure of some sort is probably going to help you keep critters out, keeping it contained so that it can break down a lot more efficiently. I grew up with the ditch method. My mom had a ditch on either side of the garden and we would put our raw veggie scraps in one ditch and the other one would be fallow. And in the spring, we'd dig up the fallow one and put it on the yard. That would then become active. And the other one would become fallow and just rest. And so she rotated this way and that to keep the organics flowing through the garden. And that's a great way to compost also. However, you lose a lot of the nutrients to the system with rain flowing through. It'll carry a lot of the nutrients away. And another reason why you want to have a system like this where you're breaking down food, nitrogen, and carbon really quickly, it captures that nutrient content more. The slower it breaks down, if I didn't want to dig in it with a pitchfork, if I just stack the stuff together, it would break down. It would just take longer. And the material that's on the outside where it stays dry, that would take longer to break down, and it may just mummify if it got too dry. That's why these wire containers, a lot of people like to use them for compost. I prefer to use them just to store leaves because, number one, they dry out so quickly. There's virtually no way to hold the moisture like there is in an enclosed container like this. They are inexpensive. That's a big benefit. And they do combine the materials together. However, you've got the concentration of material down the bottom in the center. So if I want to get my fixed compost out, I have to take the whole thing apart, take the unfinished compost, move it over, and then I can get to the finished compost down the bottom. It's one of the reasons why I like these doors. It may be time to retire this, though. We'll see. It's getting a little breaking apart a little bit too much, maybe. But other styles, if you were on the ComCon on Tuesday, you heard Dawn from Keep Durham Beautiful talking about her pallet bin. Took 4 pallets, probably from behind a store, and lashed the corners together to make a cube, and basically had one of them as like a tray on the bottom to improve aeration from the bottom. Also a great type of container, very low cost, very sturdy. And then you can also add tiers if you want, just another set of pallets on their edges. And then you can create another tier, have your material fixing while you're building a fresh pile with new material, and then, you know, move it all over, let that fix, and you can kind of rotate like that too. And, you know, if you lash the container together, then you're probably going to keep larger creatures out as well. You might have a few that come in to check it out. The only time that I found a mouse in my compost was in the winter, and it was holed up like right in the hinge. And I think it was there for warmth, really, more than the food, to be honest. But great advice about bear country. That is, you know, as we're moving into the woods more and we're moving into bear territory, they're also looking for food. And, you know, if you're not careful, this might be the source. But what other questions do we have?
Yeah, and another one from Sophie is, how often do you stir the compost in your Darth Vader container?
So I find that I end up stirring it just about every time I add fresh material, but I'm only stirring about the top maybe third of it. I'm going to go ahead and add my neighbor's compost right now. So as you can see, I'm digging this hole in the center, and wow, that's heavy. See, she's got some pasta in here. Looks like some mac and cheese, maybe. You know, I'm not going to worry about it too much. I'm just going to make sure that I bury it really, really good. So you can see I'm taking the exterior and I'm pulling it into the center and kind of pushing it out again like that. So while I add material, I'm basically stirring it, and I'll do like a really vigorous, you know, get in there and churn it all up. Maybe a couple times a month. If I didn't do it, it would just not break down as quickly. That would be the worst thing that happened if I didn't churn it. The more that I churn it, I mean, I do like to give it a few days rest. I don't want to be churning it all the time. Carbon. For the nitrogen to burn. Oh, actually, you know what? I forgot I had this. Some wood shavings. Also a nice source of carbon. I had a temporary guest in my house for a couple days and kept it in a tank. And so these are the bedding shavings. I'm going to go ahead and add those on top too. Wood shavings are nice, except that, you know, they are a little denser than leaves. They'll take longer to break down. So if you use wood shavings, bear that in mind, that you may need to add a little bit more nitrogen for them to break down. Or you can always soak carbon in water. That helps break the bonds as well. And so if you soak it first and then put it in, that's one way. But I'll just I'm just going to put that right on top. Isn't that pretty? You'd never know that there was mac and cheese in there. There we go.
Do you add water every time you add food scraps, or just when you need it?
Just when I need it. I have a rain barrel next to my house. So from time to time, I'll carry a bucket down here and water it. I water it in the summertime when it's we get 2, sometimes 3 weeks without any rain at all. The evaporation rate is going to be quite high. I'm going to water it a lot more often in the dry, hot summer. I think probably one of the biggest things that happens with people when they call me and they say that their compost isn't working, it's too dry. They just haven't watered it. Or they say it's not working, so I stop feeding it. And it's the opposite. It's so paradoxical, right? The more you feed it, the more it breaks down. Since I have my neighbor bringing her food scraps to me, it's been breaking down even faster. It's absolutely paradoxical. The more you feed it, the more it breaks down. So the more you water it, the more you keep the microbes happy. That helps too. I think we met a lot. Are we still on camera? Okay. What else you got? You guys talk amongst yourselves too. How much?
Yeah, we don't have any questions coming in yet, but I have one for you.
Okay.
A lot of people ask, shade or sun. What would you recommend of the location of the compost bin?
Those are great questions. So this guy is in partial shade. Obviously, it's in the sun right now. The heat comes from within. So when you want a hot compost, it's not because it's baking out in the sun. That's actually going to evaporate things really quickly. Shade, however, often means that there's roots. So if you're in the shade, you might end up with plant roots going up into your compost that you just have to hack away. And when you want to harvest your compost, you have to deal with the roots. So it's a little bit of a trade-off. For a long time, I had it up next to the house, but then I put in a rain barrel and I just ended up moving it down here instead. But there are pros and cons to both, but honestly, I would lean into shade just because it gets so hot and dry in the summertime. The other key is probably putting it where you can carry water to it or bring a hose to. Make sure that there's water access to your compost wherever you put it. That might even be more important than sun or shade, is access to water and proximity to your house. You want it to be convenient. If it's too far, you may not want to actually compost your food scraps if it's a walk, if it's a real chore. So, that balance between it being close to the house and, here it's, sheltered by shrubs and this beautiful magnolia tree. So I don't see it unless I come right up to it.
Awesome. Thank you. And another one from me. Do you screen your compost from your backyard, or do you kind of use it as is?
You saw it. It's beautiful, brown crumbly. The only thing that I have a problem with is roots. I might use, if I did use a screen, I've done it a couple of different ways. I've taken a screen from an old window, and it's already in a wooden frame, and then you can just run it like that. The thing that I screen more is my vermicompost because it can get really wet and clumpy. And so I want to kind of screen it out to get a little bit of air into it. I ended up investing in, I should have brought it out, in a little, it looks almost like a pan, like if I was a gold rush person, like panning for gold. It's about that size, and it's just a basin with a screen in the bottom, and the screen holes are only about, I'd say, a quarter inch. And so I like using that to screen sometimes too. But to be honest, since I've been composting a lot and, incorporating it into my soils for a good long time, what I end up doing is putting compost down. If I'm planting seeds, I'll dig a row, and I'll put compost down in the row, and dig the ditch in with the compost. again, it's about 3-to-1 soil to compost. I don't want to plant directly in the compost. I want to have that mineral content as well. I'll put that in the row, plant seeds, cover it up. And when the seeds sprout, then I'll top dress again with compost. So if my compost is really clumpy, or if it has things in it that I can still identify that I might want to screen out, back into the compost it goes. It's not going into my garden or onto my landscapes. It goes back into the compost for one more run around. I did mention chicken bones and pork chop and things like that. You know, you can go to the garden store and buy bone meal. They don't really decompose in my compost like veggie scraps do, obviously, but I do think that they erode, you know, and that calcium is very hard to come by in nature. It has a high value in the soil. So it's another reason why I like to sneak that in from time to time. I don't go overboard. I mean, I'm not like putting in, you know, like actual meat, because you know what, I eat that, you know, so it's just the scraps. But that bone, you know, so there might be a bone that appears from time to time. I'll throw that back in the compost too. Otherwise, you know, just lays on top. Looks kind of weird. So
Thank you.
is that a good, did that answer the question?
Oh,
I can go
yeah.
off on a tangent, man. Okay.
And I
Alright,
don't
guys.
see any more in the chat, but feel free
Okay.
to. Oh, here's another one from Blake. I have a neighbor that bakes their eggshells to make them more brittle. Is that a good idea, or is it an overkill?
I wouldn't. The albumin that's in the center, you know, that sticks to the eggshell is a good source of protein for microbes. They love it. You know, I prefer to cycle that into my compost rather than kind of burn it off. And eggshells, I think, are pretty brittle too. They don't necessarily break down, like I was saying about bones. It's a good comparison because they're also made with calcium. I just crack the eggshells with my hand and toss them in like that. I don't really put them in whole. I do a little decomposing with my hand first and then toss it in broken. You know, freezing first also helps break carbon bonds. So things will break down faster if you freeze them. A lot of people do that to kill any fruit fly eggs that might be on their scraps, or if they're going to take a while before they can actually compost it, it keeps the odor down that might come from organics breaking down without oxygen, without carbon. You know, you get that slimy smell. So, you know, for me, like I just take it out more frequently, especially in the summer, you know, when you've got really wet fruits and vegetables, cucumbers, zucchini, strawberries, melons, like all those scraps are down really quick. And I think the eggshells just erode. They just erode. Yeah. So I don't bother. But I wouldn't, I mean, if people are composting and they feel good about what they're doing, then you know, no harm in it. My mom puts her dog food cans in the dishwasher. I might think that's overkill, but it makes her happy. So I'm not going to stop her. I do want to say that, you know, this arrangement that I have with my neighbor is pretty cool. It happened organically. But there are also services that were talked about earlier this week. Share Waste is an app, and also Make Soil. They're both online apps where you can find other composters in your neighborhood, or if you have a compost and you want people bringing their food scraps to you so that you can get 80 gallons out of your composter every year, then get on those apps. Talk to your neighbors. If you feel like you could show someone how to do this, I mean, I'm not a composting professor per se, but I've taught composting for probably 30 years now, you know, and I love it. And I just feel like, you know, if you're doing it, any way that you're doing it, share it with your neighbors. Let people know, I'm composting in my yard. You want to learn how? Let me show you. I've got a community garden. I want to start a compost there. Maybe we can have a drop off. Be advised, you do need someone to keep an eye on it, because you don't want it to go, you know, anaerobic. You want to make sure that there's enough carbon to keep it aerated and puffy, make sure that there's a carbon on the surface to keep off flies, that it's breaking down efficiently so you're not attracting any kind of other critters. If you're that person though, go ahead and volunteer. It is so rewarding. it is so rewarding to be able to share this incredible gift of compost and, help people, realize, the joy of growing their own food, even if it's a herb garden on their windowsill from the vermicompost that they made under their sink. Even these small systems can be incredibly enriching. And you could rocket to the top and be president of the North Carolina Composting Council one day too, if you're not careful.
Oh,
So,
thank you.
Yeah.
And we have another question. How do you start initially? At first, presumably you can't dig a hole to put your food scraps in. So do you have any tips on how to get your compost bin started? Some best practices on when you first start out?
Excellent. Okay, sure. You could dig a hole. Ditch method is time honored. The compost pile, I just have a pile outside. I just pitch it out in the yard. And if you live out in the country, maybe that's acceptable. Critters will come and eat it, but you could dig a hole. Just make sure that you're covering it, mixing it with carbon. Again, you might lose some of that nutrients to the system. If you're going to start with either a pallet style or a Darth Vader style like this one, I would, select a bare swath. If it's grassy, another good place to start compost is where you actually want to plant a garden, because after you fill it and fix it, you can just lift the thing up and then spread it out, and you've got your organics in situ, basically where you want to be composting. But to start out, like a basic backyard system, get a composter and have bare ground. You don't have to dig it up. You don't have to tilt it up necessarily, but I would recommend putting a layer of leaves and maybe some twigs down the bottom to create kind of a little bit of aeration, a little bit of a vestibule, and then just start adding your food scraps, carbon, mix it up. You need a volume. You need about, most of the literature will recommend 3 by 3 by 3, a cubic yard. This is not a cubic yard. I dare say, though, at least fill it up, a couple of feet up inside with a beautiful balance of carbon and nitrogen. Make it wet, 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 and it's going to start cooking. And then do not stop feeding it. Just feed it, feed it, feed it. Make sure that you have a store of carbon. If you don't have a plethora of oak trees like I do, when I was living in Chapel Hill, I lived in a neighborhood called Dogwood Acres, but it really should have been called Pine Acres because that's what I had in my yard. I had like one obligatory dogwood, but the rest were pine trees. And, I'd be driving through Carborough and I'd see a maple and bags out by the street in the fall, and I just stuff them in my trunk. Nobody stopped me. Nobody was like, hey, stop, leaf thief. Nobody did that. And I would store the carbon to have. The fall is really the time to get leaves, to start to store them up. But, you may still find some people that are setting out leaves from time to time. But in the fall, I would encourage you, if you're planning on starting a compost, that's really the time to accumulate carbon to have not just over the winter. It's still going to cook over the winter. You're still going to get that heat surge. Remember, because the heat comes from within. If you have a good mix of carbon and nitrogen in the presence of water, but you want to have that carbon. So be thinking about your carbon source. If it's not leaves, I like using leaves also because they've been on the ground and the soil dwelling organisms, the bacteria is already attached, if you will, to the leaves. So they just add another, pathway for bacteria to get into my compost. But if you don't have that, people do shred cardboard. They might use shredded newspaper. I would never use office paper or junk mail, just because the binders that make white paper kind of shiny, bleaches, other chemicals and inks. You don't know what you're getting. It doesn't break down very quickly. I just don't like it. I prefer newspaper if you don't have leaves. And if you don't have leaves, keep your eyes open in the fall, because we're in North Carolina and you will find them at the curb, and then you can just steal them like a good composter does. 3 minutes? Wow. This has been fun.
Yeah, and just wanted to point out, Bianca shared the complete compost gardening guide as a potential resource, as a book that she's used. So yeah, everyone on the call, check it out.
I love that book. It is. Thank you, Bianca. She's the one that introduced me to that beautiful work. 2 women writing about compost in all the ways, shapes, and forms, and it's beautifully written, very lively, and lots of examples from composting in straw bales, lasagna type composting, where to get organic matter, container gardens, you name it, it's in there. So excellent. Thank you, Bianca. We good?
Yeah, I don't see any more questions, but a lot of thank yous, and that it's been very helpful.
Great. I do want to invite people to come. If you are interested in the speakers that spoke this week or other composting conversations, please come to the annual meeting. It's going to be on June 17th at the plant in Hillsborough or Pittsburgh. What did I say? I lied. It's going to be on June 15th. Thank you so much. June 15th at the plant in Pittsburgh. And we're going to have speakers. We gave a bunch of grants out. We, being the North Carolina Composting Council, gave out a bunch of grants. So the grantees are going to speak about their projects. And we're going to have some really deep soil scientists that are going to be sharing their wealth of knowledge about soil health and compost. And there will be food. And then there will be sustainable spirits. It's going to be our 10th anniversary. It's going to be a party. Y'all come.
Yeah, and I just also put in the chat, May 18th is Sustainable Spirits. Dos taquitos?
Dos taquitos. Dos taquitos. I can't say it. Close enough. Yeah. Oh, and that's going to be a plant swap. So, like my neighbor with the blueberry or thornless blackberry cuttings, bring cuttings, bring if you have asters that need thinning, brown-eyed Susans that need thinning, true story here. Go ahead and bring them to the plant swap. So many of the plants that I have in my sweet little yard are from plant swaps, and it's just a great way to grow your garden.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Muriel. I've been putting in the chat our sign up for our newsletter, our handle for Twitter and Instagram. So thank you so much for coming today for the last International Compost Awareness Week, ComCon, for the North Carolina Composting Council. So thank you so much, Muriel.
My pleasure.
Thanks, Muriel.